Hello, my name is Malia Dumont. I am the Chief of Staff and Vice President for Strategy and Policy at Bard College, and I've also been the head of Bard's COVID-19 response team since March 2020. Today, in the limited time I have, I'm going to share with you some thoughts about COVID-era decision-making in American institutions of higher education. So first, I'm going to share my screen and share my slides with you, and we'll go through these pretty quickly. So again, I'm with Bard College, and we are in the Hudson Valley in New York, about 2 hours north of New York City. So first, I want to share with you why COVID represents such an existential challenge for American colleges and universities. Most American colleges and universities have a residential population, and we provide wraparound services to our students. And in many cases, we also have faculty and staff living on campus. So American colleges and universities are more like small cities than many of their counterparts in other countries. We provide a wide array of services and amenities. It's not just housing and classes, it's also mental health, physical health. And despite a lot of advances in technology that allow for remote learning, many American colleges and universities, including the liberal arts college where I teach, Bard, prioritize in-person learning. That continues to be the main mode of instruction. Also, scholarship, advanced scholarship, robust, vibrant scholarship depends on constant free flow of information across borders, and also on a robust international student presence. At Bard, we're typical in that we have about 20% of our students from other countries, and also many of our faculty and staff come from other countries. And that ability to share information across borders was obviously greatly impacted by the pandemic. So just to recap, as you all remember, March 2020 was when the pandemic really exploded in the United States, and many public and private institutions of higher education closed down at that point. In fact, in New York, where we are located with Bard, the state government required all colleges and universities, public and private, to shut down in-person learning in March of 2020. So at that point, there were a number of unprecedented decisions that we were facing. And colleges and universities are not normally faced with such sort of crisis era decisions of such broad impact. So we had a couple of immediate decisions we had to look at and some things we had to plan for over the mid and long term. Immediately, we had to figure out how to operate under a shutdown. So that meant pivoting immediately to a fully online method of instruction, how to do that. And also, we had to face the big question of what could we do with students who could not leave campus? There were some universities that forced everyone to leave. We did not do that at Bard. Even though the state required us to shut down in-person learning, we took a broad interpretation of what that meant. We were not forced to shut down our campus entirely, and we had students from other countries who could not leave, and so we allowed them to stay on campus. That was a point of difference with a lot of other colleges and universities, many of whom felt they had no choice, especially if they were in urban environments. They emptied their campuses. So over the midterm, we had a series of very complex decisions to make about how to return to campus safely. And that included a lot of different aspects. I've listed many of them here. What does a return to campus plan look like? So that involved everything from determining what kind of testing and daily screening would be necessary. If we had to stagger work schedules of faculty and staff or have them working sometimes in person, sometimes off site. If we were going to allow any faculty and staff or student travel, what kind of cleaning and disinfection protocols were required? What kind of physical distancing could we enact in the classroom, in the dormitories? And what kind of personal protective equipment was required, and how are we going to supply it? So we're trying to understand these questions and make decisions about them at the same time that scientists are studying the virus. So this is in the spring and summer of 2020, when there really wasn't a lot of information available. There wasn't a lot of understanding about how the virus spread, what kinds of personal protective equipment was required, was physical distancing of 20 feet required or 6 feet required. There were a lot of variations in the information we were getting from scientists. And then another big question we had to determine was whether or not we were going to require vaccination of our students, faculty, and staff. So the immediate questions we took care of immediately, because we knew right away, because the government told us to, we could not teach in person. So it was just a problem-solving method of how do we quickly transition to online learning. And we had accessibility of Zoom, and we created some task forces to help faculty transition to online learning. So that was sort of a technical issue that we were able to resolve. I mean, it was a difficult technical issue, but we were able to resolve it. What to do with students who could not leave? Again, we just decided immediately, we're not going to force students to leave if they have no place else to go. Or even if the place that they're supposed to go home to is less safe than Bard. For example, we had students from China who definitely could not go back home. We also had students from New York City. And in March 2020, when we were forced to shut down our campus due to state regulations, New York City was a huge COVID hotspot, and many students felt safer, not only felt safer, but were safer on our relatively rural, isolated campus than they would have been if they had gone home and squeezed into a high-rise apartment with a number of other family members. So we allowed them to stay on campus. But the bottom line is there was an enormous amount of uncertainty that we had to navigate. So how did we do that? So I want to outline quickly some institutional approaches to decision-making and how we at Bard approach those. So I think primarily our decision-making was informed by our institutional values. And I saw a great variation of decision-making across American institutions of higher education. A lot of that was linked to institutional values. At Bard, a couple things that we really value, the in-person connection, the personal relationship between faculty and students. So we valued in-person learning above all, and so we knew immediately that we were going to return to in-person learning as soon as possible. A lot of other institutions weren't as clear with themselves on that point, or so they didn't know what their goal was with regard to in-person learning. They took more of a wait and see attitude to see how the science developed, whereas we knew we were going to push for in-person learning as soon as possible. We also highly prioritize individualized support to students. So that means taking things on a case-by-case basis, leaving a lot of room for flexibility for unique cases, such as the students from New York City who didn't feel safe going home to their houses, to their families in the middle of an outbreak. And we also really prioritize, in many cases, voluntary compliance. So we emphasize from the beginning to our community that we, the COVID response team, we, the college administration, are not turning into law enforcement officials. We don't have the ability to do that, nor do we want to do that. And so we really emphasize from the beginning that this is a community effort. We're all in this together, and we have to work together and encourage each other to abide by the practices that we think will keep us all safe. So there were only a few things that we ended up requiring absolutely at Bard, and the rest of it was voluntary compliance. And I have to say most people bought into that. So state and federal guidance and requirements varied tremendously by state. So in New York, we had a state government that really, frankly, was very suspicious of college and university students who they thought that young people were basically incubators of plague and would not act in a responsible manner. And so they disseminated, I think it was a 30-page list of requirements that we had to meet before we would be allowed to reopen. And it was very, very detailed. Contrast that with a state like Texas, where the only requirement the state of Texas put out was that no college or university would be allowed to require vaccination. And that was pretty much the only guidance that institutions in the state of Texas received from their state government. So the parameters that the state of New York set for us were very clear. They weren't always helpful in that we didn't always agree with all of them, but they were very clear. And so we knew what our operating space was, and that reduced the amount of uncertainty we were dealing with. Our decision-making was also informed by our risk assessment. I saw a great variation here among different institutions. Some institutions really emphasized or were looking more strongly at what they considered the medical risks associated with COVID to be versus the financial risks. So a lot of institutions that, rich institutions, I would say. So I paid particular attention to what Harvard was doing because I got my master's degree from there. And so as an alum of that institution, I was interested in how they were managing this. So Harvard, with its, I think, over $4 billion endowment, had no financial risk, really, that COVID was laying upon them. And so they focused almost entirely on the medical risk, and they pushed students out, all students, on very short notice. I saw some other schools do that as well. I heard anecdotally that the University of Michigan gave many of their students 24 hours to move out of the dorms. And so that kind of risk assessment put a lot of burden on individual students. At Bard, because we're much smaller and because we are a rural school, we didn't have the same level of medical risk as some other institutions, or we didn't feel that we did. And also, like our survival as an institution is tied to keeping students in person as much as possible. I mean, that's how our model works. So that was how we thought about risk assessment. Finally, we used many different kinds of resources to inform our decision-making. We did enter into a contract with some locally based medical experts who helped us understand the scope and scale of the medical issues we were facing. Now, we didn't, that wasn't the only thing we relied on. I mean, medical experts were, of course, very important. But we also, the pandemic created an environment where we had a lot more interaction with government officials, which ended up being extremely helpful. So we set up weekly meetings with the local mayor. We also entered into weekly meetings with our county health department, which was connected directly to the state. And that was the way we got quick information back and forth to the State Department of Health. And then the White House set up a COVID task force, and that shared best practices and at one point convened some institutions of higher education to talk about our particular challenges. So those were some great resources for us. We also entered into new kinds of conversations with our peer institutions. There were a lot of sort of email distro groups that already existed, but hadn't been used to the extent we started using them during COVID to share best practices, to ask questions. And that was really helpful in making sure that we weren't going too far into left field with our decision making, that we were thinking about the same things, not forgetting anything that some of our peer institutions were looking at. And then I think it's really important that we considered our community members to be important resources. What I saw in some communities who were less successful is that they considered the community members the objects of their planning and not participants in their planning. And with us, it really helped that we tried to involve community members as much as possible by communicating with them frequently, by asking for input, and by having a lot of sort of open fora where they could come ask questions and provide ideas. So we knew from the beginning, as I said, that we wanted to reopen Bard to fully in-person learning as soon as possible. And so we had to shut down in March of 2020, according to the state. And our plan always was to try to reopen in August 2020, which we ended up doing. So we did provide some remote options because, as I said, we do have this this focus on individualized learning. Some students who are immunocompromised, some faculty members, or some who, for various reasons, they weren't able to come back to campus, we allowed them to have remote options. So, for example, our entire freshman class of students from China weren't able to leave China. And so we provided remote options for them, including by setting up an agreement with a university in China where our students could be in residence as international students, even though they were Chinese, of Chinese nationality. They were able to be registered there as international students, take remote classes from Bard, but also take in-person classes in that Chinese institution that were transferable. So we spent a lot of time and effort over that summer informing our community of what our plans were. And we were always very clear that we hoped to reopen in August 2020 to fully in-person learning, but that we were working towards what would make it possible. So there were a lot of requirements we had to meet from the state of New York. We submitted, I think it was like an over 100-page plan that we were required to submit to the state to meet all of their detailed requirements. And we had a lot of policies and procedures, including a 2-week quarantine period that every student had to go through upon returning to campus. So we just made all of that happen. And we were very clear with students that we were relying on them to voluntarily comply with all of these measures. Weekly testing, daily screening. It was really intense and very comprehensive. But people, by and large, complied with it. And so we went through from August until the end of November without a single COVID case being detected on our campus. The first one didn't happen until late November 2020. And that's a testament to the participation of our full community in the decision-making process and the feeling of ownership I feel like they had in what we were doing. So just a few lessons learned to share. I think became pretty clear that managing uncertainty is harder if your institutional values are unclear. Our institutional values were not unclear. We always knew what our goals were. But I watched some other institutions struggle with trying to set goals because they weren't sure what was more important to them, whether avoiding the medical risks was more important or trying to get back to in-person learning as soon as possible was more important. So for us, that wasn't much of a question, and that minimized the uncertainty we were dealing with. If you can't communicate decisions, then communicate your goals. What I mean by that is we were very clear from the time we shut down in March 2020 that we wanted to reopen to in-person learning as soon as possible. But we weren't able to tell people right away when we would know that. We would say things like, we will update you again next week on how things are developing. And we would continually let people know the decision space we were operating in. So they had an expectation of what we were moving towards, even if they didn't know exactly when the decision would come down. So I did see some other institutions who communicated decisions before they had a clear goal. So in April 2020, a number of institutions said, we're going to reopen right away. And then they had to walk back that communication because they couldn't make it happen. The state wouldn't allow them to. So there was, I think, in some places, an over-eagerness to communicate these very specific decisions on specific timelines that they weren't able to abide by in the long run. And that hurt their ability to communicate effectively with their community. So it definitely takes a village. We had collaborative development of policies. In March of 2020, we stood up our COVID response team, which had faculty and staff representation from the administration, from different departments and programs academically across the campus, and had really wide representation. So every department, from athletics to the health service, to the dean of the college was represented, and we had every decision we made about policies was collaboratively arrived at. And oftentimes we would call on those other resources, our peer institutions or our medical consultant, to help us come to a decision. But it was all done in this group environment. And we were often in meetings with this large group. It was almost 20 people. We were in meetings together, just talking through all the details, 5 or 6 hours a week, just among that group. And then each one of us was on different committees as well. So it was very intensive. And I did little else for the first year of my job on the COVID response team, other than developing COVID response policy. Transparent, timely, and empathetic communication was really important. I think especially the empathetic. Every email we sent out from the COVID response team, we were really cognizant of how frightening and difficult this was for our community. I mean, it was frightening and difficult for us, the decision makers, but even more so for people who had access to less information than we were dealing with, or were being buffeted by all kinds of challenges that we didn't have insight into. So we were very, very careful about being really empathetic. And I think that created a lot of goodwill in our community, and helped us create space for how we approach more difficult decisions. There wasn't any question on campus that we, the COVID response team, were trying to work towards the good of the larger community. And then a wonderful lesson learned, which went against the expectations of the New York State government and also the New York Times, which in a number of times published articles that referred to college campuses as potential incubators of plague. Well, as I mentioned, we didn't have a single COVID case on our campus until the end of November 2020. And the mayor of our town really did an about face. He was very anxious and expected our students to not be in compliance and actually to be dangerous for the community when we told him that we wanted to bring everyone back for in-person learning in August of 2020. A couple of months later, he came back to us and said, your students are really setting the example for the community. So that was wonderful to hear. And I think that's a result of the fact that instead of taking an enforcement mentality, we really focused on voluntary compliance and this idea that we're all in it together. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to end sharing the screen here if I can figure out how to do that. Thank you very much for your attention.